Welcome to the June 2026 edition of FO Exclusive. With me is Glenn Carle, Senior Partner at FOI. He's a retired CIA officer. He's a noted geopolitical analyst. He is the author of The Interrogator. He, together with others at FOI, advises companies, investors, and organizations on geopolitical risk. I am Atul Singh. I am the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. We have more than 3,000 authors from over 90 countries. We look at the deeper issues behind the news, provide context and many perspectives from around the world. I'm also a partner at FOI. FO Exclusive is a recap and analysis of the most important issues of the world. One of our friends, a chap on Capitol Hill, called it a compulsory listen, watch, if you want an in-depth understanding of what's going on and if you're interested in making sense of the world. So without further ado, we'll crack on. Last month, we discussed a tale of two summits in Beijing. We discussed great dangers to the global economy. This month, we will focus on two key issues. Number one, Iran trumps Trump in new art of the deal. Number two, Keir Starmer falls to the King of the North. Before we carry on, we will do our lightning round as usual, and we will recap the most important issues of the month. So here we go, the lightning round. Well, let's begin with SpaceX. We are spoiled for choice this month, as we are almost every month, and the challenge is what to leave out instead of what to leave in. But we'll begin with SpaceX because it had a momentous, mountainous initial public offering, an IPO. And this IPO is being talked about all around the world. A lot of people think it is a tribute to Elon Musk's genius. There are many, however, who say that this is not entirely so. And Usama Malik, one of our authors, has penned a wonderful piece called Paid in Mars, How the SpaceX IPO Engineers Away Accountability. And Usama's argument is SpaceX IPO is not a marker of company success, but rather indicative of an eroding market. Systems are being quietly rewritten to make exceptions for the few at the cost of established financial institutions. The precedent SpaceX and Elon Musk set may shift the free market from the public domain into a private affair for billionaires. Now, why is he talking like this? It is because there was a $1.7 trillion floor. This was roughly 94 times trailing revenue. The most expensive stock in the S&P 500, Palantir, trades at 67 times sales. Meta went public, growing 66% a year at 28 times revenue. Google, growing 240%, went out at 10. Value SpaceX three segments at twice what their public rivals command, a deliberately softball exercise, and you reach $1 trillion, which is still not $1.76 trillion. And Goldman Sachs, where I briefly worked, very briefly, they expect SpaceX's AI revenue to increase 100-fold by 2030. Now, I certainly don't believe that. Do you, Glenn?
I'm less skeptical than the colleague you just cited, but I hope that I am not among those who I think are fundamentally launching tulips to space, and then see everything burst in the sky above them. SpaceX is unquestionably the leading business in the industry and is qualitatively ahead of all others. But from that, I think, objectively true statement to saying that it really should be the only stock one owns and control all stock markets everywhere is delusional.
Yeah, exactly. And the total addressable market that Usama points out is $26.6 trillion. That is nearly the size of the entire US economy, of which 22.7 trillion is filed under enterprise AI. That's about 30 times the size of the enterprise software market that actually exists. So I have, I have worked in deals before. In my earlier incarnation as a corporate lawyer, I was a very junior grunt when Ferrovial bought BAE for a pricely sum, I believe, at that time for $19 billion. Please don't crucify me if I'm getting my numbers mixed up a little bit because it was a while. And I have a brother who works in capital markets, and I do not know of a single professional who is entirely in agreement with these numbers. In fact, off the record, they use lots of colorful language on the record because they are scared of losing business. None of these bankers, whether they are at Goldman, whether they are at Davis, or whether they are lawyers at Davis Polk, whether they are at any top bank or any top law firm, they're willing to say a single word against this IPO. But it's interesting how private comment and public comment diverge so dramatically. So I'm quite skeptical.
Well, I'm sure I will. I'm sure I will offend any number of people listening to us and anyone who hears me later. But the data is pretty telling. I mean, it cannot be challenged that 95% of the world's financial experts, stock market experts, underperform a randomly chosen portfolio of stocks over a period of 10 years, and it's 85% over a period of 5 years. So the insights that one has to something that cannot be predicted are zero, but the fees are usually 2%. So with SpaceX, the fact is that when the Starship, which is the name of the rocket that they're developing and quite near to having operational, comes into operation, it will lower the cost of launching a kilo to space by a minimum of an order of magnitude, from $5,000 per kilo to 500, and it could be substantially more than that, a greater reduction. No other company is within many years of being able to replicate that, and so the interest and the assessment that SpaceX is something different is correct. From that, however, to say that it is worth more than the GDP of the United States or something like that is just absurd.
And this raises problematic questions about relaxing all sorts of rules for listing on the markets. It raises questions as to how to arrive at valuations. It raises massive questions about conflicts of interest. But we will park that because this is not an analysis of SpaceX IPO. We will move on to the rocket-like rise of Zohran Mamdani within the Democratic Party. Left-wing challengers have ousted 2 House Democrats in New York on Tuesday. We are recording this on Wednesday, 24th of June. And Republican Dan Goldman has lost in a landslide to Brad Lander. And they all want to vanquish Trump's fascism. Representative Adriano Espilet, I don't know if I'm getting the pronunciation right, has lost to Daria Liza Avila Chevalier, a pro-Gaza activist who had never sought office before. Claire Valdez, another Mamdani ally who rallied with Bernie Sanders and Mamdani, won an open seat over Brooklyn's borough president. And her slogan was Solidarity Forever, abolish ICE, free Palestine, organize your union, and join DSA. I think DSA is Democratic the Democratic Socialist Alliance. So the winds of change are blowing in many directions. And this perhaps is because this wind towards the left is coming at a time when the US economy is increasingly reliant on tech and rich people, while consumer industries and poorer people are falling down. We know from data this month that traditional consumer goods companies are struggling. The Financial Times reported this, no less, and that is not a Marxist paper. They've been hobbled by insurgent rivals and flat population growth. Rich people's wealth is being boosted by the surging stock market. Moody's chief economist told Bloomberg that should there be a market tumble, which Glenn and I expect, which many other people expect, the economy would be extremely vulnerable. The lower half of wage earners in the US have barely seen wage growth for a year. And this month, data came out, which was in keeping with data that has come out earlier, that 37% of Americans could not cover an unexpected $400 expense. Or I'll repeat, 37% of Americans could not cover an unexpected $400 expense from cash or savings. In 2021, the same survey found the figure to be 32%. So in 5 years, from 2021 to 2026, the figure has gone up by 5%, so 1% a year.
If I could add one,
yes,
I think, corrective to what you said, you focused on the past year of largely stagnant wages for the working, wage-earning Americans, and I'm sure that's true, but it's true more broadly for the past decade and longer. Wages for most Americans have been, after inflation, compensation calculations and so on, roughly flat. And when you add to that the top 1% of the nation's population holds over 30% of all of the nation's wealth, and the bottom 50% holds 2.7%, I think it is, of the nation's wealth, with stagnant wages. And then you add to that the fact that inflation is on the whole low at the macro level. But when you look at the critical items that on which an average person bases his decisions and derives his perception of reality, the cost of transportation, the cost of home insurance, the cost of medical care, and the cost of certain foodstuffs, all of those are not up just 2.8% or whatever the current inflation rate is, but up roughly 40%. And that explains why the indebtedness of the American citizen has been increasing in the following way. Credit card debt has been rising. This is why the economy has not shown a downturn in consumer spending, because people are using their credit cards to cover those specific items that I mentioned because they want to have a roof over their head. But credit card debt cannot continue to rise forever. And given all of these factors, the tensions that you describe, Atul, I think continue to be misunderstood or ignored by the powers that be, because that is describing the reality for most Americans. And it explains why I struggled for so long to understand why there was such disaffection among the American people when the macro indicators seem to indicate a strong economy. And in the macro sense, that's true. But if you have money, then you don't have a problem. And not everyone has money. That is the problem.
Exactly. And speaking of problems, it's not just the US seeing disaffection. If we go all the way to India, and the reason we are going all the way to India is because the Supreme Court the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, called the youth, who are largely unemployed, cockroaches. It wasn't the wisest use of term. Remember, this is not a politician. This is the Chief Justice of India, the CGI. And a recent Boston University graduate started, I suppose, as more as a kind of social media protest, if nothing else, a party called the Cockroach Janta Party, which is the Cockroach People's Party. And it grew exponentially, and it grew speedily, and it went up like one of Elon Musk's rockets. And it soon, this Cockroach Janta Party had more followers on Instagram than the Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling BJP, which was hilarious. And this is coming because a lot of the young are unemployed. A medical school entrance exam basically had to be cancelled because the paper had leaked. The school board exams, the equivalent of GCSEs, say in the UK, or A-levels in the UK, or Abitur in Germany, or any school leaving exam anywhere in the world, it turns out that the copies had been corrected or marked inaccurately. Half the answer script was somebody else's. Half of it was obviously another person. So it was, shall we say, a tragedy of errors, not a comedy of errors. And this is Asia. So students often commit suicide if they get bad grades. Entrance exams decide the trajectory of your life. And all of these are headed by Indian administrative service officers, people who clear one exam and they move in from agriculture to running school boards or exams. And these are punishment postings. And all of these institutions basically are not working. And as is the judiciary. If you go to court, you can be in court for 20, 30 years. So the youths who do not have jobs, who do not have prospects, who have no faith in institutions, who actually no longer have faith in the republic itself, they have taken to a protest that may not be necessarily very constructive, but it is certainly indicative of the disaffection. And it's not just the US going through this, but also India, and I'm sure other parts of the world. Perhaps inflation is partly to cause, perhaps the cost of living is at fault, perhaps the US-Israel-Iran war has pushed things over the edge. We'll come to that later. But things are not right in many, many, many democracies around the world, especially the poorer ones that are more vulnerable. Now, moving on from the poorer democracies to the richer ones, Norway, a rich democracy, is reconsidering joining the EU because the world has moved from a benign world, in the words of the country's foreign minister, to a crazy world. Now, remember, the Norwegians voted in 1972 and 1994 to remain outside the EU. However, tariff wars with Washington and NATO's growing divisions have pushed them towards the EU. The EU obviously would be keen to admit Europe's biggest oil and gas producer. They are indeed looking to add new members. They are not looking to add the UK, or they are less open to a return of the UK, but nevertheless, the EU may expand. Whilst Norway is planning to rejoin the EU and the EU might be planning to expand, the Trump administration has been expanding the role of the government in the economy. We are moving to some kind of dirigist economy, which basically is a tradition from the Spanish, or rather the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the French free Catholic countries, wherein an elite at the capital decides the allocation of capital. So people sitting in Madrid or Paris decide how the economy should function. This was championed at its height by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, not Stephen Colbert. Just this was a finance minister of Louis XIV. And the Trump administration, perhaps thinking, that Donald Trump is the modern Louis XIV, has decided that the government is very wise, is full of the smartest people on the planet, and they've decided to invest $2 billion in 9 quantum computing companies. This is a major bet on nascent technology. The idea is to make them commercially viable. The US government will receive some equity. It will act like a sovereign wealth fund. Note that the US recently backed a rare earths magnet maker and a mining company. So the idea is that...
If I could jump in for a moment, wearing
Yes,
my 17th century hose, there's an ironic element to what you're describing, which is not humorous. It's something that people, I think, should really be aware of, because we do know what the future contains, given the past in this. Where does this dirigisme, this directed economy model come from? As you say, it comes from the French Colbert, who centralized the state and thought that, in a way, it's the Platonic ideal that the wisest men should make the decisions and centralize power so that it can be efficient. And that all sounds quite rational. But it was also chosen during the Cold War context, when the clash was between the communist ideal embodied in the Soviet Union and then in Beijing, and the capitalist one in Washington. But the French, of course, never wanted to be subservient to anyone, certainly not to the United States, or to this Anglo-Saxon free market capitalism. And so, in part, for political reasons, in part for geostrategic ones, and in part out of heritage, they refused this laissez-faire, pure Western capitalism model, as they rejected is what I should say, the totally centralized state industry nationalization model of of communism. And they came up with this dirigiste economy. However, the empirical results are categorical, that the economies that grew the fastest, that therefore had the means to respond to various social issues, whether it's healthcare or paving a road or buying a bullet, whatever it is, guns and butter, we used to say when I was studying economics, the most successful economies were those that are the capitalist ones. The least successful, in fact, catastrophically failures, were the communist ones, because communism is actually antithetical to any sort of functioning of an economy. And those in the middle were the dirigistes, the directed economies, which chose certain sectors. However, we also know that nationalized industries almost invariably underperform the private industries because of the laws of economics and the efficiencies that come from competition. So we know what is happening. And Donald Trump and his disciples, who are the theoreticians, believe that they're making these efficient decisions. It's always attractive to say, I know better what should be done, and I control the levers of power, so I'm going to do this because we need to have quantum computers. But the fact is that over time, this is not a short-term phenomenon, over time, none of the national efficient industries tend to compete or develop new techniques as efficiently as in a more capitalist economy. Now, you can direct resources more successfully as in a centralized state, as Beijing shows by all the cemented pores and various other things it does quite successfully. But whereas we are now benefiting, Americans aren't for domestic reasons, but the world is benefiting from Chinese solar technology and EV technology. I think it's 20 of 21 Chinese EV companies are running at a loss, which means that the Chinese taxpayer in communist China is subsidizing the development of an industry at a loss for everyone, except for the benefit of the consumers who are buying it. So that's what will happen with this dirigiste scheme of the Trump administration.
Well, the dirigiste scheme is to put money in quantum computing, fusion power, self-driving cars, and AI. The idea is that the technologies of the future cannot be owned by China. and therefore the technological edge should remain with the US. That's the logic. The US is also worried about dwindling cache or cache of munitions. Trump has asked defense companies to produce more weapons. Car companies with excess capacity apparently could also help produce missiles. Stockpiles are now low because of the war. Congress is looking to bar defense contractors from executing stock buybacks or paying dividends without Pentagon approval. To be honest, I have some sympathy with that, because in some ways what has happened in the stock market is far too much manipulation. And it's not just the SpaceX IPO, but the chief executives in America have run amok. There's very, very little control by shareholders. A lot of money they use to effect buybacks and boost up their own shares, and therefore, because they own shares or stock options in the company, their personal wealth rises. So I'm not sure I entirely oppose the Congress there, but I don't know if this directive, or this dirigist's model of saying increase production, stop the waves like King Canute, and the waves will stop. All of this is happening whilst Chinese ascendance in biotech, not just all the industries I mentioned, is raising alarm. Lilly entered into a latest agreement with a Chinese drug maker. Pfizer announced a tie-up with a Chinese firm to develop drugs. And now people, or let's say some of the experts in the field, are saying biotech is the latest battleground, and we cannot let China take over biotech as it took over electric vehicles. This raises into questions all sorts of things: innovation, process expertise, cost efficiency, labor, talent, capital, global supply chains. We could go on, but we will stop and we will move on to our top two issues of the month. We will talk about issue number one: Iran trumps Trump in new art of the deal. And before we carry on, we must point out that we, wearing our FOI hats, had the FOI geopolitical risk monitor in May 2026. And we had another briefing on the US-Israel-Iran war. And our managing partner, Sanjay Acharya, who put in endless sleepless nights, produced a rather polished finished product that has been much appreciated. And pretty much the war has unfolded exactly as we predicted. Now that we have blown our own horn, we can carry on with our analysis. Over to you, Glenn. What's going on? Why is it important? Why should we dance in our grass skirts celebrating victory? Or why we should worry that the sky will fall on our heads? Or why maybe we should just shrug our shoulders and carry on? Over to you.
Well, it's awkward to be a triumphalist amidst catastrophe, but that's sort of where we are. So, what's happened in the U.S.-Iran war? I'll call it. There is some sort of an agreement percolating, cautiously showing its head, and immediately having the part of the head that is shown cut off, and then hesitation as to whether there is an agreement and so on. But there fundamentally has been a cessation of the fighting, and the regular violations of the ceasefire by both parties really have been parts of the negotiating process. I'm not being facetious in the least. So we now have something called the U.S.-Iran Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. And what does it mean? What are the consequences of this understanding? Washington has agreed, Donald Trump has agreed to lift the American blockade on the Iranians in the Straits of Hormuz. Washington will pull back its naval forces within 30 days, but 30 days from when remains a little fuzzy. Washington ends sanctions on Iranian petrochemicals and oil sales, which really means sales of petrochemicals and oil to China and elsewhere. They now become possible. This is a dramatic shift from the circumstances for many years prior to the outbreak of hostilities about 4 months ago. Washington pledges, this is hard even to imagine that Washington is pledging this, but it really is Donald Trump. Washington pledges to prepare, quote, an international reconstruction fund of $300 billion, that's B like a boy, $300 billion for the wayward international terrorist state Iran. For its part, Iran has offered a 60-day pause in hostilities. And if all of these wonderful terms that I just iterated from the American side are not fulfilled, then the 60-day pause need no longer be respected. Iran offers a, quote, temporary, unquote, 60-day agreement to allow commercial vessels to transit the strait without charge. And then Iran will, quote, maintain the status quo on its nuclear program while talks continue, which means while Iran verifies that the United States carries out its side of the agreement. And then Iran insists, this is all in the memorandum of understanding, that Israel desist from and stop its attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon. And de facto, the United States has pressured Israel to adhere to this element of the agreement because Israeli attacks on Hezbollah were stopping the Iranians from agreeing to the memorandum of understanding, the peace agreement, as I just laid it out. Now, what were Trump's war aims? Why did all of this start? Well, they were incoherent, ad hoc, and constantly changing, but they seem to have several elements that were ideals and serious, I guess. Eliminating Iran's nuclear program. That has been the leitmotif of all countries' policies towards Iran for decades. That was the sine qua non of the American objectives. What has been the result? The current future, as I just described it, is a clear regression from the JCPOA agreement that Obama and the Iranians negotiated and that Donald Trump withdrew from on his first day in office in 2016. So the Iranian nuclear program is less constrained than it has been in decades. The United States was seeking to overthrow the Iranian regime, the Mullah regime. What is the result? In fact, we have a more hardline series of rulers in place who were more securely in power than they were antebellum. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards have for years been the de facto string pullers in the Iranian system. And now they don't have to pull the strings. They have their hands on the levers. They run the state. The mullahs now serve the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. It has become a militarized state. Since the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards are fundamentally a military organization at this point. Another objective of the United States was to degrade Iran's conventional military capabilities, notably its missile capabilities and stockpiles. What has been the result? The conventional capabilities were always of Iran, have been for many years largely toothless, incapable of projecting power beyond Iran's borders in a conventional sense, except for missiles and surrogates. What is the result? The conventional forces have been decimated, but they were incapable of projecting power beforehand. So touted as a great success, this really doesn't add up to too much of anything and change the status quo in that regard that had existed before. The missile capabilities have been degraded, but now the intelligence community of the United States assesses that 70% of the Iranian capabilities from before the war remain operational. And the Iranians continue to demonstrate that they can, at a lesser degree, strike anywhere and anyone in the Middle East if they wish. And thus, even the threat of these missiles is a de facto destabilizing element that the Iranians can brandish still. And then the objective that was not an objective, the reality that emerged, is the new reality of warfare, and that is drones. They were not mentioned, and now drones define war making and the war space worldwide. We see this in Ukraine, see it in the Straits of Hormuz. And asymmetric warfare has been a concern of American military strategists and large military organizations' concerns for decades. Asymmetric meant a terrorist in the mountains for years. Now it means drones. A $500 drone can destroy, and does routinely, a $20 million tank. A $50,000 missile or series of drones can destroy a $12 billion aircraft carrier. So for major powers, the consequences of the war, major military powers, are earth-changing, which is directly relevant to Russia as they've been experiencing in Ukraine, to the United States as it has just experienced in the Straits of Hormuz, and to China as it contemplates absorbing Taiwan. And I would argue the next one would be Turkey, which is seeking to project its powers in some ways too. I wouldn't include India. India is less expansionist, but certainly this is relevant for all countries with military issues that they need to worry about.
Glenn, if I can very quickly,
please,
if I can very quickly add to your point, Iran has really focused on asymmetric warfare. They have done rather well. They have used drones brilliantly. They have used their missiles well. They have battered American bases. They have also hit oil refineries, gas plants, aluminium. And today morning, I was speaking to someone who has lived all over the Middle East, speaks Arabic and Farsi, has detailed knowledge of the Middle East. And he pointed out that at the end of the day, Iran is a really difficult country to invade. So invasion is not on the table because you've got the Elburz Mountains and then you've got the Zagros Mountains. And, the joke that Iran is a Persian cat, it's on the map, it's sort of shaped like a cat. Because Iran is difficult to invade, unlike, say, Iraq, you can even if you destroy conventional forces, doesn't mean your troops can move in. Guerrilla war would be very painful for any invading force, and more importantly, because it has so many mountains, when it comes to critical weaponry, nuclear stuff, missiles, drone manufacturing, you name it, they can very quickly, very easily, not very easily, but very quickly use geography to their advantage and keep the critical bits of their arsenal, keep the critical bits of their weaponry safe. And so with their use of asymmetric warfare at the Strait of Hormuz, which they've blocked, and with the use of their proxies, the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Shias, you've served in Lebanon, you know Lebanon well. The Shias had a sense of burning resentment because they were the underclass, and they are maniacal and fanatical in their support for Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is a formidable fighting unit. And the Houthis, who are also not to be underestimated because they have stood up to both the UAE and the Saudis who've tried to crush them. So using these relatively cheap asymmetric weapons and forces, Iran has brought the entire region to a standstill, and the Strait of Hormuz offers a fantastic choke point to hold the world to ransom. 20%, over 20% of the world's oil and gas passes through that. Over a third of the world's fertilizers passes through that strait. Aluminium, so many other things which we've covered in great detail go through that. And this means that Iran can exert an can give an inflationary shock that comes and hits all the way to US domestic market. Anybody buying eggs, anybody buying bread in even a US supermarket will feel the pinch. Forget about the other more vulnerable countries, unless we forget the 1973 oil shock, and the 1979 oil shock were partly because of Iran, and the 1970s led to stagflation. So I have said repeatedly that the 2026 Hormuz crisis is for the US what the 1956 Suez crisis was for the UK. Over to you, Glenn.
I don't think it's quite as I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't characterize it as an empire-ending event, but it is certainly I certainly agree that it indicates a lasting shift in American downward in American power, or in great power, ability to project influence and power. It's historic. Certainly, I certainly agree with that. The last thing, the last objective that the United States and Israel sought to achieve in the war was to stop Iran's support for its regional surrogates, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthi, and Shia groups in Iraq. And what's the result? The surrogates are weaker, substantially weaker. The Houthis perhaps not. But that's not from the American-Israeli attack on Iran. That's from the Israeli attack against Hamas and then Hezbollah. Now, I said explicitly, as did others, of course, right at the beginning of Israel's counterattack, to be accurate, against Hamas 3 years ago, that it was impossible to destroy Hamas, that a conventional military cannot destroy a movement. It's not an organization. It is an ideology and a movement. And that has been proven correct. And something to a point that you made, Atul, and relevant to the one I just made about the surrogates. It's true that the British won most major battles, not all, against the Americans. And their conventional military was the finest in the world at the time. And the Americans were militiamen, mostly. I'm simplifying. But there are two differences in the situations for the belligerent parties. For the Americans, the issue was existential. For the British, it was something they wanted to do, to recontrol the colonies. For the Americans, so long as they continued to exist and had somewhere they could go, they could not be defeated. And therefore the British lost. What was the American experience in Vietnam? It was identical. Can the Americans invade Iran and win every battle? I think unquestionably yes. But are the Americans willing to pay, and not just Donald Trump, would the Americans be willing to pay the guaranteed large number of sustained, continuing casualties, meaning deaths of Americans? And the answer to that is no. For what, would be the thought. And what is the issue for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards? It's existential. And they have, as Atul pointed out well, many places to go. So the dilemma is almost insoluble from the American perspective. And the result actually is that the surrogates are weaker, but they remain. So short, medium term, there has been a shift in the battlefield space security and state security as a result of the weakening of surrogates by Israel. But that does not change the structural nature of the hostility of the groups and the reason that they exist and the fact that they continue to exist. Now, just I'll finish to be quick because there's another subject to discuss. All of these are very important conclusions and consequences of America's failure and defeat in attacking Iran. But there are strategic implications that are even broader. Iran will be, so long as the regime lasts, and a strong regime, which is totalitarian, can be brittle too, but I'm not predicting its decline, but that could happen because most Iranians loathe the Revolutionary Guards. So for now, Iran is stronger than it was before. Israel is tactically and operationally safer for the medium term, which would be a number of years. Long term, worse off because, as Israeli politicians point out themselves, Israel has turned the attitudes of its supporters in the world to now critics, as we found in the elections that Atul talked about here in New York last night. Then the U.S. and great powers, as I said, have to confront that there's an equalization of the battle space, and hegemony is more elusive than ever, and we are in a far more unstable world. And on that, we could go on, but it's the war has ramifications. The U.S. attack on Iran has ramifications far beyond anything that's ever entered Donald Trump's head.
I'll just add the domestic aspect to it. You've already said Iran is ascendant right now. The regime has survived. It controls the Strait of Hormuz. But in the US, there is now an air of political crisis. Why do I say so? I say so because the Republican-controlled US Senate has passed a measure demanding that President Donald Trump halt the war or seek congressional approval before continuing military action. The House of Representatives passed the same measure earlier this month. Note, this is the first time that both the House and the Senate have passed a concurrent resolution instructing a president to end military action since the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was enacted. So this is also a very significant element. The fact that Republicans are turning against Donald Trump, note that the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, is immense. And they are not going against Donald Trump just for kicks. They are going against Donald Trump because their constituents are saying, hang on a minute, this was supposed to be over very quickly like Venezuela. We don't want to pay the cost in blood and treasure. We have plenty of problems at home. 37% of us cannot afford $400 from cash or savings. So why the hell are we spending money like water on a conflict in foreign lands precisely when you came to power, promising that you wouldn't get into foreign misadventures? So the domestic element is extremely important. And I always point out all politics is fundamentally local. And America lacks the will, lacks the stomach for the fight. There aren't anti-war demonstrations as in the days of Vietnam, but the tide has turned. The tide of public opinion is firmly against the war. Now, moving on to the second issue that we will raise. And the second issue that we are going to examine is simple. Keir Starmer falls to the King of the North. So, what is going on? Well, those of you who have been living under a rock know, or might want to know, there is a country called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Once upon a time, this was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Once upon a time, this country, this blessed Green Isle, had a global empire. And once upon a time, London was the city on the planet. It's still a wonderful city. I am sitting in Vienna today. I've just flown in from London. And London is magical, as is Vienna. But neither Vienna nor London are capitals of flourishing empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed more than a century ago. The British Empire collapsed, let's say, half a century ago, or a little bit more than that, 56 onwards, or if you want to set the clock, 47 onwards, 1947 onwards, when India, Pakistan, and modern-day Bangladesh became independent. Then as India and Pakistan, which included East Pakistan. But I'll not digress. Sir Keir Starmer is Prime Minister. He was a fantastic public official. He was head of the Crown Prosecution Service. He, by all accounts, and he and I have a mutual friend called Martin Plout, who's written for Fair Observer, written an article about Keir Starmer when Keir became Prime Minister, and a very complimentary one. And by all those who know Keir say he's an honest, decent, and hardworking public servant. By all accounts, he was an excellent lawyer. However, and this is what his critics say, and this is what I believe as well, he has no vision, no direction, no agenda, no policies, and no governing philosophy as Prime Minister. And that failure of leadership is why he ended up in a series of mini crises, and eventually he resigned. He resigned on Monday, day before yesterday. Like Rishi Sunak, Sir Keir Starmer has the charisma of a dead mouse. He has made far many U-turns. He has demonstrated damaging lapses in judgment. When Labour won in 2024, we analysed the elections, and I published an article saying the left won big in the UK, but look deeper. Now, in 2024, the Labour Party won 411 seats out of 650 in the House of Commons. In the previous elections in 2019, Conservatives had won 365 seats, breaching Labour's fabled red wall in the north. And so the Tories had won under Boris Johnson and won big, and then Labour won even bigger. And so prima facie, you would have said, wow, this is magnificent. This is a great achievement. The answer was yes and no. Why? Because it was a shallow victory. In the UK's first past the post system, you just need to get more votes than the others. And Labour had won 33.8% of the vote. And that percentage enabled them to win 411 seats, an addition of 209 since 2019. The Conservatives dropped to their lowest vote share, 23.7%. They won a mere 121 seats, a drop of 244 seats. The Liberal Democrats won 12.2% of the vote.
But the key point is that the victory, which appeared substantial, was structurally thin.
Yes. And the number of votes actually went down, even as the seats went up, the absolute number of votes. And I was talking about the Liberal Democrats, who won 12.2% of the vote and got 72 seats, an addition of 61. And compare them to Reform, the rising party of the right, which is stealing votes away from the Tories. At Reform UK won 14.3% of the vote, but they won only 5 seats. So the margin of victory wasn't great. The number of votes weren't great, and if we look at the graphs that we did during this time, the reason for victory was the collapse in Tory support, because the Tories had been in power for a while. David Cameron was Prime Minister, and David Cameron announced Brexit referendum in 2016. And then, of course, he lost the referendum. He resigned. Theresa May took over. And then Theresa May ended up falling on her sword. And Boris Johnson, who is a Falstaffian figure, who thinks he's Churchill, but is a portly former journalist, with a turn of phrase, he acts as a bumbling buffoon, and in the words of an English journalist, or was it a politician? I'm forgetting. No, it was a journalist, his former boss. He's a sly fox disguised as a teddy bear. And, the sly fox did get to the top of the grease ball, but COVID destroyed his premiership. And eventually, Starmer won. And Starmer thought that if only an honest, decent man got in and got stuck in, things would improve. The Starmer thesis was Tories were responsible for all the problems in the UK. The reality is that you hear each time you visit Britain, and when I flew out from London at Heathrow, the luggage belt wasn't working. Our luggage didn't arrive in Vienna. It was a metaphor for everything going wrong with the UK. And people talked about, at the airport itself, broken Britain. And in the words of a dear friend, Alexander Carle, living in Britain today is like watching the Romans turn into Italians. Britain had 5 prime ministers in 37 years. And it has had 7 in the last 10 years, 7 including Andy Burnham, who will soon be prime minister. And so Britain now has Italian-like political instability, even though it does not have the proportional representation electoral system. Now, where did Starmer go wrong? Well, he made blunders as soon as he took office. He scrapped a popular winter fuel handout for pensioners. And then, of course, he had to make a U-turn. He admitted he had accepted free gifts of clothing and football tickets from wealthy donors. He appointed Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the US. It turns out that the Dark Lord, that is what was Peter's nickname, one of New Labour's architects. It turns out that Lord Mandelson was close to Jeffrey Epstein, who needs no introduction, a billionaire or multimillionaire sex offender. And all in all, Starmer stumbled through his years in office. His supporters say, look, he helped steered international support for Ukraine after Donald Trump largely withdrew American backing. He managed Trump quite well, at least before the war broke out. He worked to position Britain for a leading role in the AI revolution. Most importantly, his supporters point out, he brought down net immigration from the record levels that had fueled support for the populist right. And mind you, there was record immigration under Boris. It was called the Boris wave. So all of that may be true. We can be charitable and say it was, he achieved something. But the reality is Britain has deep-rooted and difficult problems. The debt-GDP ratio, we've talked about it before, is very high, at nearly 100%. Bond yields are rising. And as Glenn has pointed out earlier, when bond yields rise, when interest payments rise, there is less money for guns and butter. And in the words of Andrew Neil, in politics, Britain has had a parade of mediocrities. Andrew Neil is a famous journalist. And so you've got all these people who have been professional politicians with no experience of real life who come in, focus on social media. Ironically, politics in the UK is carried out on American social media platforms. And then, of course, they come to power, but they have no policies, they have no governing philosophy, and they have no bottle to achieve any major reforms. And muddling through doesn't suffice anymore because of these major problems in the UK. Now, the person who triggered the fall of Keir Starmer is Andy Burnham. He is known as King of the North. He was mayor of Greater Manchester from 2017 to 2026. He was MP for Leigh from 2021 to 2017. So this is a chap who comes to London, then goes back to Manchester. During his parliamentary career before becoming mayor, he held several cabinet positions. He was lastly Secretary of State for Health from 2009 to 2010 under Gordon Brown. Burnham identifies as a socialist. He's associated with the soft left faction of the Labour Party. Importantly, and this will shock you, Glenn, perhaps, and he's a Catholic, as was Boris Johnson, as was Tony Blair. So in the land of Henry VIII, which broke off from the Catholic Church on the grounds of course, religion, or let's say slim and sexy Anne Boleyn, it is almost heresy that now you have Catholics coming to the top
Well,
job.
speaking as the descendant of the Puritans, I can tell you that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, never went far enough from Rome for true separatists' taste.
Importantly, Andy went to a Catholic school, and in his words, Catholic social teaching underpins my politics. We did have to read the catechism at school, but it is powerful and strong and right. So that is what Andy says. Unlike Boris and Tony, though.
Tell us why this has happened, though, not what has happened. I mean, this is it's a shock, and there is paralysis. But why is there paralysis and then the shock?
Well, Britain is broken partly because the stability of politics and the two-party system that underpinned it is now gone. The society has fractured, and so has politics. So you have the Greens eating away the vote of the Labour Party on the left. Some people think the Labour Party has sold out to big donors. And there is Reform UK and now Restore UK eating away votes of the Tory party from the right. So the middle, Britain was typically a common sense country which avoided crazies in the 1930s. They laughed at them. It neither turned fascist like the Italians, nor did it turn Nazi like the Germans. The far right figures were largely cartoonish, and after 1945, Britain was able to decolonize far less painfully than, say, France or even the Netherlands. So Britain always had a streak of pragmatism. And go back to the 1950s and you get R.A.B. Butler and Hugh Gaitskell. Or Butler was Tory, Gaitskell was Labour, and their policies were so indistinguishable that the term Butskellism was born, which was a fusion of their two names. So Britain very much adopted a common sense, middle of the road policy and the ability to compromise. And now the voters are more fractious, and in a way, Britain hasn't never recovered from Brexit. In 2016, by voting for Brexit, they set in chain a series of events to which there hasn't been a resolution. There was much that arguably was wrong with Brussels. Brussels can be bureaucratic. At the moment, there's an internal fight in Brussels because some Latin countries want to increase the size of the civil service, and the Protestant countries who may have lost faith, but have certainly lost the culture, say, hang on a minute, why do we want more bureaucrats? So there were problems with Brussels, but at the end of the day, the EU is the UK's biggest trading partner. The UK had great heft within the EU. The UK provided a lot of intelligence and diplomatic expertise to the EU. And this is not the Brits saying this. This is Germans saying this. The Danes say this. The Austrians, where I say this. The UK was a valuable member of the EU and made the EU a better entity, particularly if you were doing trade negotiations. But by leaving the EU, this fractious divorce, and it was partly because of immigration that Britain left the EU, partly because of bureaucracy, partly because of that great slogan that Dominic Cummings came up with, "Take back control." And there was this idea that Britain was losing parliamentary sovereignty. So all of that, led Britain to go away from the EU. But what next? And no one was clear as to what next. Some wanted to go left, some wanted to go right.
A word of sympathy for Keir Starmer and for Liz Truss and for all the other prime ministers, frankly, whether they're Tory or Labour. Yeah. Franklin Roosevelt, I think it was, said that it was very difficult to lead when you looked over your shoulder and found that no one was following. And in the current British society, which is just an example of the fractures and the tensions in all democratic, economically advanced countries, there is paralysis because the electorate is incoherent. It doesn't want taxes, and it demands services. It wants fundamentally, that's the simple issue. Or it doesn't want immigrants, but it wants cheap labor, and so on. And these are conundrums that no politician can solve. The only way to solve it, you touched upon, which is to have a charismatic leader who says, "Follow me," and stirs up the crowd, and the crowd will follow him. But to do that, you have to be, frankly, a bit of a simplifier, uh, which is almost synonymous with a charlatan, selling a simple solution to problems that have no simple solutions, or solutions that imply significant sacrifice on some part of the electorate. And so this is the so far unsolvable dilemma of democracies in a responding to the strains of globalization. The American response for the past decade has been to find accept a charismatic leader who thinks he knows where he's going, but takes you right into the cliff with every decision that he makes. And the British solution, until 2 days ago, was to find a competent man who no one would follow anyway. No one would even follow into a pub. So I have some sympathy for democratic leaders, coherent as they might be, but cannot be.
On that note, let's crack on with the replacement, or the king waiting to ascend the throne. And as I said, is a Catholic, unlike Boris and Tony. But unlike Boris and Tony, Andy went to Cambridge, not Oxford. Now, Oxonians have largely held the top job in the UK. 31 British prime ministers have been Oxonians. Only 14 have been Cantabrigians or Cantabs. And he studied English literature at Cambridge. In the words of his critics, it shows, because he's financially numerate, so they say. And his plans on taming the bond market are delusional. Anyway, he will be the first Cambridge lad to enter 10 Downing Street since Stanley Baldwin, who was there a long time ago. Now, Burnham finished fourth in the 2010 leadership Labour Party election. This is not his first shot. This is his third shot. 2010, he got 10.4% of the vote. Burnham came second to Jeremy Corbyn in the 2015 election, with 19% of the vote in the first round, compared to 59% for Jeremy Corbyn. But in COVID days, during the COVID era, he stood on the steps of Manchester's Central Library, clad in jeans and a worker's jacket. He inveighed against COVID restrictions put in place by the then Tory government, Conservative government of Boris Johnson. And of course, he tried to run as the Labour candidate for a by-election on 24 January. Starmer shot it down. Eventually, of course, he did win in Makerfield, and now basically Starmer's had to go because MPs have shifted their support. Now, importantly, Burnham opposed the devolution of health services to local leaders as Shadow Health Secretary in 2015. Less than a year later, he championed this very devolution because he was running to be the mayor of Manchester. So this is a man who has flip-flopped. This is a man who his critics accuse of being extremely opportunist. And as a friend of mine pointed out that he has an impossible square to circle, or Labour presides over an unwieldy coalition of liberal and lefty middle classes, the working class white voters, and minorities, mainly Muslims. And so each of these Labour supporters wants different things. And the Tory party support is also fragmented. And so Burnham coming to power at a time when people want better social services, at a time when people want some kind of a containing of the cost of living crisis, at a time when inflation is high, at a time when there are hardly any jobs, at a time when public finances are under strain, is going to be difficult. There is no magic bullet for Britain, and broken Britain, will find that there is no cape-clad hero who can just save it. So there we are. Keir Starmer is gone, and perhaps it is the first of many other leaders to fall as the cost of living crisis and inflation surges through the global economy. Before we end, we've had Shiju Verghese and Shantini Gupta talking about the fact that we should point out to one fact about the Cockroach Janata Party, that a large number of their social media members are from Pakistan. Apparently, there are bots that Pakistan has used to inflate these numbers. And this is fundamentally an effort by external actors to sow discord in India and weaken the Indian state. That certainly has an element of truth. Pakistan has long believed in Operation Tupac, bleed India through 1,000 cuts. I grew up at a time when bombs were going off. I'm an army brat, so my father was operating on people who had been shot to bits because of Operation Tupac, the Punjab insurgency, and then Kashmir, and I served in Kashmir. Having said that, we also have to point out that the Indian state is now increasingly incompetent and fundamentally corrupt. And every single day, corruption scandals are making the news. And IAS officers themselves, honest ones, are sending me stuff over WhatsApp about their colleagues stealing from the exchequer or stealing from the till hand over fist. So yes, Shantini, Shiju, you're right, you have a point. But at the same time, there is real disaffection. And that includes India, that includes the UK, and that includes the US. All these diverse democracies are deeply divided, and they do not have any simple solutions to complex problems. So much so for June. Glenn, famous parting words before we convene again in July.
I don't know if they're famous. I think the takeaway, and this doesn't help us directly, is that Keir Starmer and the ostensible peace agreement percolating in between the U.S. and Iran are both signs of a world in turmoil, not in transition, where the great powers can no longer exercise influence as they did before, and societies are fractured, and there's no visible way out of this fracture for the time being.
All right. We will see you next month in July, the month where America will celebrate its 250th anniversary. And of course, France, its Fifth Republic, will celebrate Juillet 14, 14th of July, Bastille Day. All right. We shall see you anon. Bye.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.